That Saturday morning, I just wanted to peacefully fish like every other weekend. But less than an hour later, I was standing before the neighborhood council, accused of violating community aesthetics just because of my grandfather's old wooden chair. I don't know if you've ever met someone who likes to control everything like that, but comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this madness. I kept thinking all I had to do was prove how ridiculous this was and it would be over, but I was wrong. This whole thing dragged on for 6 months, cost me nearly all my savings, and then I decided if they wanted war, I was going to play the biggest game of all. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. My name is Grant Miller, and I'm a software engineer who works remotely from a cabin I inherited from my grandfather on Lake Harmony. It's this beautiful, quiet place about 2 hours north of the city, where the water is so clear you can see the bottom even 20 feet out. My grandfather bought this place back in 1962, and every weekend since I was 8 years old, we'd sit on that old wooden dock with his handmade fishing chair, teaching me everything about patience, life, and how a good bass thinks. When he passed 3 years ago, he left me the cabin and 40 acres of prime lakefront property that had been in our family for decades. The place was perfect for my lifestyle. I could work my tech job during the week, then spend weekends maintaining the property and fishing in the exact spot where my grandfather had taught me everything I knew. The neighbors were mostly quiet retirees and a few other families who'd been coming to the lake for generations. Everyone knew everyone and we all respected each other's space. At least, that's how things were until Paula Whitmore moved in 2 years ago. Paula was 29, worked in marketing for some real estate company, and had this habit of wearing polyester dresses that looked expensive from a distance, but wrinkled if you breathed on them wrong. She accessorized with these plastic hair clips covered in fake gems that caught the light like a disco ball, and she wore platformed sandals that made her wobble when she walked on anything that wasn't perfectly flat pavement. From day one, Paula seemed determined to improve our little community. She got herself elected as HOA president within 6 months of moving in, which should have been my first red flag. But I minded my own business, figuring as long as she left me alone, I'd leave her alone. Boy, was I naive. The morning everything went sideways was one of those perfect October days where the air is crisp but the sun is warm, and the fish are practically jumping into your boat. I'd gotten up early, made my coffee, and headed down to the dock with my grandfather's old wooden chair, the same one he'd sat in for 40 years. I was maybe 30 minutes into my morning routine, just enjoying the peace and quiet, when I heard the click-clack of those ridiculous platform sandals coming down my driveway. Paula appeared at the edge of my property, wearing a bright yellow polyester dress that looked like it came from a discount bin, her fake gem hair clips glittering in the morning sun, and an expression that could sour milk. She marched right up to my dock like she owned the place and announced, "Mr. Miller, that chair violates our community aesthetic standards." I nearly dropped my fishing rod. I turned around to look at her, thinking maybe this was some kind of joke, but her face was dead serious. Her makeup was applied with what appeared to be a paint roller, bright blue eyeshadow, orange foundation that didn't match her neck, and lipstick that was somehow both too red and too bright for human consumption. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "This chair doesn't meet the aesthetic harmony requirements of our community," she repeated, pulling out an official-looking piece of paper. "I'm issuing you a notice of violation. The fine is $150. I stared at the paper, then at Paula, then at my grandfather's chair. It was a simple wooden fishing chair that he'd built himself in the 1970s, sturdy, weathered, and perfectly functional. It wasn't fancy, but it wasn't an eyesore either. It was just normal. "Paula," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "this chair's been here for 40 years. My grandfather built it himself. It's on my own property." She shook her head like I was a child who didn't understand basic math. "Standards matter, Mr. Miller. We're trying to maintain a certain quality of life here, and that," she pointed at the chair like it was roadkill, "doesn't fit our vision." I tried to explain the history, how my grandfather had built not just the chair, but half the improvements around the lake, how our family had been stewards of this land since before most of these houses even existed. But Paula wasn't listening. She was too busy writing out the violation notice with the kind of flourish that suggested she was enjoying every second of this. As she handed me the paper, her plastic jewelry caught the sunlight and nearly blinded me. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Miller. We have standards here, and everyone needs to follow them." She turned and click-clacked back up my driveway, leaving me standing on my own dock, holding a fine for the crime of sitting in my grandfather's chair. I looked down at the violation notice, then out at the peaceful lake, then back at the chair that had seen 40 years of quiet mornings and family memories. That's when I realized this wasn't about a chair at all. This was about control, and Paula Whitmore had just declared war on the wrong person. After Paula left that morning, I couldn't concentrate on fishing anymore. I kept staring at that ridiculous violation notice, wondering how someone could move into a community and immediately start telling people what they could and couldn't do on their own property. So I did what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I started digging into exactly who Paula Whitmore was and what kind of authority she thought she had. What I found made my blood pressure spike higher than a teenager's phone bill. Paula had only been elected HOA president 6 months earlier, in an election where exactly 7 out of 12 homeowners bothered to vote. She'd won by a whopping 4 votes, which meant she was representing the interests of roughly 33% of the community, while acting like she had some kind of mandate from heaven. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The really fascinating discovery was something called the Lake Visionaries, a group that Paula belonged to, along with 3 other people I'd never heard of. According to their not-so-public social media, Paula had done this before. The Lake Visionaries had already transformed 2 other communities into luxury resorts. The Lake Visionaries had successfully transformed 2 other lakefront communities in the past 5 years, turning them from affordable family neighborhoods into high-end resort areas where the original residents could no longer afford to live. But Paula wasn't done with me yet. 3 days after the chair incident, I found 2 more violation notices tucked under my windshield wipers. The first one was for unauthorized waterfront furniture. Apparently, my grandfather's fishing chair fell into this category, even though it had been sitting in the same spot since the Carter administration. The second notice was for non-compliant dock maintenance, targeting the wooden dock that my grandfather had built in the early 80s. According to Paula's interpretation of the HOA rules, the weathered wood didn't meet current aesthetic standards and needed to be replaced with community-approved materials. The total fines now added up to $750, which was more than my monthly cabin maintenance budget. That's when Paula made her first real tactical error. Apparently, she decided that issuing violation notices in the dark of night would send a stronger message than doing it during normal business hours. I woke up one Thursday morning to find a massive wooden sign hammered into the ground right at the edge of my property line. The sign read, "Do not fish, by order of Lake Harmony OA," in large black letters that could be seen from space. The problem with Paula's midnight guerrilla tactics was that she hadn't counted on Eli Burke, my neighbor and the local contractor who knew every property line in the area better than the county surveyor. Eli was out for his morning jog when he spotted Paula's handiwork, and being the kind of guy who doesn't let things slide, he walked right up to the sign and asked in his loudest voice, "Who the hell put this thing here, and who gave them permission to dig holes on someone else's property?" His voice carried across the lake like a bullhorn, waking up half the neighborhood. By the time I got outside with my coffee, there was already a small crowd gathered around Paula's unauthorized sign, and everyone was asking the same question. What gave Paula Whitmore the right to put up signs on other people's land? I grabbed my phone and started recording the whole scene, capturing Eli's questions, the neighbors' reactions, and Paula's conspicuous absence from her own sign installation. When I posted the video online later that day, it went viral within the local community faster than gossip at a church potluck. Paula's response to her sign embarrassment was to double down on the drama. She called an emergency community meeting for that Friday evening, sending out official-looking invitations that made it sound like the fate of the entire neighborhood hung in the balance. The meeting was held in the community center, which was really just a converted garage that smelled like old lawn mowers and disappointment. Paula had prepared what she clearly thought was an impressive presentation, complete with poster boards and pie charts, all about her Vision 2025 premium lakeside community. She wore a shimmery blue pantsuit, and her makeup was applied with more enthusiasm than usual, giving her the appearance of someone who'd lost a fight with a cosmetics counter. The presentation itself was a masterpiece of delusional thinking. Paula outlined her plans to transform Lake Harmony into an exclusive lakefront destination that would attract the right kind of residents and eliminate elements that detract from property values. When she got to the slide about non-conforming activities, which included fishing, boat maintenance, and excessive outdoor storage, I realized that she wasn't just targeting my chair and dock. She was targeting the entire lifestyle that had made this place special for decades. But the most revealing moment came when Agnes Rowley, a 77-year-old retired legal advisor who'd been living on the lake for 20 years, stood up and asked Paula a simple question. "Young lady, where exactly do you get the authority to regulate activities on private property that aren't covered by our original HOA agreement?" Paula's response was textbook deflection mixed with barely contained irritation. Well, Agnes, I think it's clear that some people aren't committed to improving our community. We need to modernize our standards if we want to compete with other premium lake destinations. Agnes and several other long-term residents weren't having it, pressing Paula about her authority and questioning the legitimacy of her new rules. The room got quiet enough to hear a pin drop, and Paula's makeup started to smudge around her eyes as she realized she was in deeper water than she'd planned for. The standards are clearly outlined in our updated community guidelines, she stammered. But the older residents just exchanged knowing looks that suggested they'd dealt with this kind of nonsense before. That night, I went home feeling like maybe I had some allies in this fight after all. But I also had a nagging feeling that Paula Whitmore wasn't the type to back down just because she'd been embarrassed in public. As I sat on my dock in my grandfather's chair, looking out at the lake that had been my family's refuge for 60 years, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I was right. The next morning, I had a voicemail from someone at the county building department asking me to call them back about some concerns that had been raised about structures on my property. Paula Whitmore was escalating this war, and I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. The call from the county building department was my wake-up call that Paula wasn't just some annoying neighbor with delusions of grandeur. She was someone who knew how to work the system. When I called back, the clerk explained that they'd received a complaint about unpermitted structures on my property and would need to schedule an inspection within the next 2 weeks. The complaint specifically mentioned my dock, my storage shed, and something called unauthorized waterfront modifications. I'd inherited all of these structures from my grandfather, and as far as I knew, everything had been properly permitted back when it was built. But proving that would require digging through 40 years of paperwork that I wasn't even sure still existed. That's when I decided to call my old college buddy, Cal Weston, who'd become a real estate lawyer and specialized in exactly these kinds of property disputes. Cal had always been the smartest guy in our class, but more importantly, he'd grown up dealing with HOA battles because his own family had been harassed by power-hungry neighbors when he was a kid. When I explained the situation, Cal's first question was simple. Gran, do you actually know what you signed when you inherited the property? Because 90% of these HOA problems come from people who don't realize what authority they've actually given away. That afternoon, Cal drove up to the lake with a briefcase full of legal documents and the kind of focused energy that made me glad he was on my side. We spent 3 hours going through every piece of paperwork related to my grandfather's property purchase and the original HOA agreement. What we discovered was better than I'd hoped for. My grandfather had been smart enough to negotiate specific exceptions when the HOA was first formed in the late 70s. According to the original agreement, his property, including the cabin and 50 feet of lakefront, was classified as grandfathered private property with explicitly protected rights for traditional recreational activities and existing structures. In plain English, that meant Paula's HOA had about as much authority over my fishing and my grandfather's chair as they had over what I ate for breakfast. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting and set the record straight, but I made a tactical error. I assumed Paula would be reasonable when presented with facts and legal documentation. I should have known better. The meeting was held the following Tuesday evening, and I came prepared with copies of all the relevant documents. Paula had dressed for the occasion in a purple polyester outfit, with matching shoes and enough jewelry to stock a small gift shop. Her makeup looked like it belonged on a Vegas stage, with false eyelashes you could spot from across the lake. When my turn came to speak, I calmly explained the legal situation and provided copies of the documentation to everyone present. I showed them the original property agreements, the HOA formation documents, and the specific language that protected my rights to use my property, as my family had for decades. The neighbors' reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for: relief and support for maintaining the community's traditional character. Eli Burke stood up and said, "Thank God someone's finally got the paperwork to prove what we all knew. Paula's been making up half these rules as she goes along." Several other neighbors voiced similar sentiments, creating a wave of community support that I hadn't expected. But Paula's response was not what I'd expected from someone who'd just been thoroughly debunked in front of the entire community. Instead of backing down or acknowledging that she'd overstepped her authority, she doubled down with the kind of stubborn defiance that would make a mule proud. "Rules are rules, Mr. Miller," she declared, her voice rising to a pitch that could shatter wine glasses. "And if you think you can just ignore our community standards because of some old paperwork, you're going to find out how wrong you are." Her false eyelashes were practically vibrating with indignation, and her purple dress had somehow acquired several wrinkles, despite being made of material that was supposed to be wrinkle-resistant. That's when I realized Paula Whitmore wasn't just wrong, she was dangerously delusional. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards or property values. This was about a person who'd moved into an established community and decided that everyone else needed to change to accommodate her vision of what the place should be. After the meeting, as people were filing out and several neighbors came over to express their support, I overheard Paula talking to her husband Neil in the parking lot. Neil was a thin, nervous-looking guy who always seemed to be apologizing for something, and tonight he was doing his best to calm Paula down, but she wasn't having it. "This isn't over, Neil," she hissed. "Grant Miller thinks he's won something, but he has no idea what we're capable of." The "we" in that sentence was what really caught my attention. Paula wasn't operating alone in this campaign to transform Lake Harmony, and I was beginning to understand that the Lake Visionaries weren't just some social club for people with too much time on their hands. They were an organized group with a proven track record of taking over communities and pushing out residents who didn't fit their vision of the perfect neighborhood. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Paula's threat wasn't just empty bluster. She'd already shown that she was willing to involve county officials and bend rules to get what she wanted. The question wasn't whether she'd escalate further, it was how far she was willing to go, and what I was prepared to do to stop her. The answer to that question came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 official-looking envelopes slipped under my door sometime during the night. The first was from the county health department, asking me to schedule an inspection of my septic system. The second was from the building department, requiring an electrical inspection of my cabin's wiring. The third was from the Lake Management Authority, an organization I'd never heard of, demanding that I provide documentation for my dock's environmental impact compliance. Paula Whitmore had just opened 3 new fronts in her war, and I was starting to realize that I might need to fight fire with something bigger than fire. The 3 inspection notices were just the beginning of Paula's new strategy. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself caught in a bureaucratic nightmare that felt designed to drain my time, money, and sanity until I simply gave up and moved away. The septic inspection alone cost me $400, not counting the day of work I had to take off to be present for it. The electrical inspection required me to hire a certified electrician to bring some of my grandfather's original wiring up to current code, another $800. The dock inspection was the most expensive, requiring an environmental impact study that cost $1,200 and took 3 weeks to complete. But the financial cost wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Paula patrol the neighborhood like some kind of suburban sheriff, documenting every activity with the dedication of someone conducting a military surveillance operation. She'd installed professional-grade cameras around her property, with at least 2 that had clear sight lines to my dock and cabin. Every morning when I went out to fish, there she was, either watching from her deck or walking past my property, always carrying a clipboard and wearing those ridiculous outfits that defied both logic and good taste. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early November. I'd been dealing with Paula's harassment for almost 6 weeks, and the stress was starting to affect everything: my work, my sleep, even my appetite. I was sitting on my dock in my grandfather's chair, trying to find some peace in the routine that had anchored my life for nearly 3 decades, when my phone rang. It was my mother, calling from Phoenix, where she'd retired 5 years earlier. "Grant, honey," she said in that voice that mothers use when they're about to give advice you don't want to hear, "maybe it's time to think about selling the cabin. Your grandfather wouldn't want you to be miserable over a piece of property, no matter how much it meant to him." I hung up, my hands still trembling. The wind rippled across the lake's surface, but inside me there was only emptiness. I gripped the armrests of the wooden chair tighter, this chair that was the only thing anchoring me to this place, as if letting go would send me drifting away with the temptation to give up. For the first time since this whole mess started, I seriously considered surrendering. Paula had turned my sanctuary into a battleground, and I was exhausted from fighting a war I'd never wanted to be part of. The weight of my grandfather's expectations, my own stubbornness, and the mounting legal bills pressed down on me like the gray November sky above the lake. I was trying to decide which lesson from my grandfather applied to my current situation: fight for what matters, or know when to walk away. When Agnes Rowley appeared at the edge of my property. Agnes was wearing her usual practical outfit, but her expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Grant, dear, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I think there's something you need to know about our friend Paula." She sat down in the spare chair I kept on the dock and pulled out a manila folder. I did a little research into the Lake Visionaries, and what I found should concern anyone who cares about this community. What Agnes had discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The Lake Visionaries weren't just some casual group of friends with shared interests in property development. They were an organized network that specialized in identifying undervalued lakefront communities and systematically driving out long-term residents to make way for high-end developments. According to Agnes's research, their pattern was always the same. First, they'd get one of their members elected to a leadership position in the community. Then, they'd begin implementing increasingly restrictive rules, always framed as community improvement. Residents who couldn't comply would be fined, harassed, and eventually forced to sell their properties at below-market prices. The lake visionaries would then arrange for development companies to purchase them for conversion into luxury resorts or high-end housing developments. They've done this successfully in 2 other communities, Agnes explained. Lakewood Estates and Pine Harbor both went from affordable family communities to exclusive developments within 3 years. In both cases, more than half the original residents were forced out. Agnes paused and looked directly at me with the kind of intensity I'd learned to respect. Grant, I don't think Paula Whitmore is just some annoying neighbor with control issues. I think she's the advanced scout for a systematic takeover of our entire community. That revelation changed everything. This wasn't about my fishing chair or my grandfather's dock or even Paula's delusions of grandeur. This was about preserving a way of life that had existed at Lake Harmony for generations and protecting the families who'd built their lives around this place. As Agnes and I talked through the implications, I felt something shift inside me. The exhaustion and frustration I'd been carrying transformed into something much more focused and dangerous: determination. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. That evening, I spent 3 hours at the library, researching everything I could find about property law, HOA regulations, and real estate development in our county. What I learned was both encouraging and alarming. The encouraging part was that property owners had more rights than most people realized, especially when it came to resisting HOA. The alarming part was that the lake visionaries had been very careful to work within the system, using legitimate processes to achieve illegitimate goals. If I was going to beat them, I'd need to be smarter, more prepared, and more strategic than they were. As I drove home that night, passing Paula's house with its ridiculous security cameras and perfectly manicured lawn, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight Paula Whitmore's war. I was going to change the rules of the game entirely. The next morning, I called Cal Weston and asked him a question that probably sounded crazy at the time. Hypothetically speaking, what would it take to buy an entire lake? Cal was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his lawyer brain. Grant, that's a very specific hypothetical question. Are we talking about Lake Harmony specifically? When I confirmed that yes, we were talking about my lake, Cal's tone shifted from curious to intrigued. Actually, that's not as impossible as it sounds. Most people assume lakes are public property, but you'd be surprised how many are privately owned. Give me a few days to research the ownership structure of Lake Harmony, and I'll get back to you with some real information. While Cal was doing his legal research, I decided to tackle a project I'd been putting off for years, cleaning out my grandfather's storage room in the basement of the cabin. The room was packed with decades worth of files, photos, and documents that I'd never had the heart to sort through after he passed. But something Agnes had said about researching property history made me think there might be important information hidden in all that paperwork. I spent the better part of a weekend going through boxes of old receipts, tax records, and correspondence. Most of it routine stuff from the 1970s and 80s. But in the very last box, buried under a stack of fishing magazines from the Reagan administration, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a manila envelope marked Lake Purchase Documents, Incomplete, in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside were copies of legal papers, surveyor reports, and correspondence with someone named Harrison regarding the potential acquisition of Lake Harmony water rights and surrounding undeveloped property. The most interesting document was a partially completed purchase agreement dated 1978, with my grandfather's signature on the buyer's line and a blank space where the seller's signature should have been. According to the attached notes, the deal had fallen through at the last minute when my grandfather decided he couldn't afford the full purchase price, but there was a clause that gave him right of first refusal on any future sale of the property. I called Cal immediately and read him the relevant sections of the documents I'd found. His excitement was palpable even over the phone. Grant, this could be huge. If that right of first refusal was properly recorded and never expired, you might have a legal claim that supersedes any other potential buyers. But we need to verify that the current owner is the same Harrison mentioned in your grandfather's papers, and we need to find out if he's ever considered selling. Cal promised to start tracking down information about the current ownership of Lake Harmony, while I continued digging through my grandfather's papers to see if there were any other relevant documents. What I found next was even better than the purchase agreement. In a separate folder marked Harrison Correspondence, I discovered a series of letters between my grandfather and someone named Robert Harrison, discussing not just the lake purchase but a shared frustration with developers and speculators who want to turn every quiet place into a tourist trap. In one letter dated 1979, Harrison had written, "William, I respect your decision to withdraw from our arrangement, but I want you to know that my offer stands permanent. If you or your heirs ever want to discuss purchasing Lake Harmony, you'll have my full cooperation. I'd rather see it in the hands of someone who understands what this place means than sell it to people who only see dollar signs." The final piece of the puzzle came when Cal called me back 3 days later with information that made everything click into place. "Grant, you're not going to believe this. Robert Harrison still owns Lake Harmony, and he's still alive. He's 82 years old, lives in a retirement community about an hour south of the lake, and according to public records, he's been paying property taxes on that water and about 200 acres of undeveloped land around the lake for the past 45 years. Cal paused for dramatic effect. And here's the really interesting part. Harrison's been getting pressure from developers for the past 2 years, trying to get him to sell. Guess who's been coordinating those development inquiries? I didn't need to guess. The Lake Visionaries. Cal confirmed my suspicion. Specifically, a development company that has financial connections to 3 of the 4 Lake Visionaries members, including our friend Paula. They've been trying to convince Harrison to sell the lake for development into a luxury resort, but he's been refusing their offers. According to county records, they've made increasingly aggressive approaches, including having lawyers contact him about maximizing the potential of underutilized recreational property. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Paula's harassment of me wasn't just about transforming the existing community, it was about softening up the area for a complete takeover that would require Harrison to sell his lake to the development company. But Harrison had been refusing their offers, and now I understood why. He still shared my grandfather's values, protecting special places from developers. If Agnes was right about the Lake Visionaries' timeline, they were probably getting desperate to close the deal with Harrison before the community organized effective resistance to their plans. That's when I realized Paula's escalating harassment of me wasn't just personal vindictiveness. It was a calculated strategy to demonstrate to Harrison that the community was already in chaos and that selling to developers was his only option for restoring peace. That evening, I sat on my dock in my grandfather's chair, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and orange, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. I wasn't just going to fight Paula Whitmore and the Lake Visionaries. I was going to buy Lake Harmony and remove their ability to destroy this place forever. It was a crazy plan that would require spending most of my savings and taking on debt that would change my life for years to come. But as I thought about my grandfather's letters to Harrison, about Agnes's research into communities that had been lost to development, and about all the families who'd built their lives around this lake, I knew it was the right thing to do. The Lake Visionaries had picked the wrong fight, and they were about to discover what happened when you threatened something that people were willing to sacrifice everything to protect. Contacting Robert Harrison turned out to be easier than I'd expected. Cal had found his phone number through public records, and when I called and introduced myself as William Miller's grandson, Harrison's response was immediate and warm. "Grant, I've been wondering about William's family for years. How is the old cabin holding up?" We talked for over an hour about my grandfather, the lake, and the changes that had happened in the community over the decades. When I finally explained the situation with Paula and the Lake Visionaries, Harrison's tone shifted from nostalgic to grimly amused. "So that's what this has all been about. I knew those development people were up to something, but I didn't realize they'd planted someone right in your community to soften things up." Harrison agreed to meet with me the following weekend to discuss the possibility of selling Lake Harmony under the terms of my grandfather's original right of first refusal. But he had one condition that initially seemed strange. "Grant, I want to meet at the lake itself, at your grandfather's cabin. I haven't been back there in 20 years, and I want to see what we'd be preserving before I make any final decisions." I agreed immediately, not fully understanding the significance of his request until later. What I didn't know was that Paula had been monitoring my phone calls through some kind of electronic surveillance system, and she knew about my meeting with Harrison before I'd even hung up the phone. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday afternoon, but Paula decided to force a confrontation before Harrison and I could complete our negotiations. On Friday evening, she sent out an emergency notice to all Lake Harmony residents, announcing a community crisis meeting for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. The notice was full of dramatic language about external threats to our community vision and actions by certain residents that could jeopardize our collective property values. She'd even arranged for the meeting to be broadcast live on social media, apparently convinced that public pressure would force me to back down from whatever she thought I was planning. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what promised to be an ugly confrontation. The community center was packed with nearly every resident of Lake Harmony, plus a few people I didn't recognize who appeared to be there in some kind of official capacity. Paula had outdone herself for the occasion, wearing a bright red polyester suit that looked like it had been designed for someone running for political office in a small town, complete with a matching red hat that defied both gravity and good taste. Her makeup was applied with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been planning this moment for weeks, and her fake jewelry caught the fluorescent lights like a mobile disco ball. The meeting began with Paula delivering what she clearly thought was a stirring speech about community values and the need to resist outside interference in local affairs. She'd prepared a presentation complete with charts and graphs showing property values in other lakefront communities, arguing that any deviation from her development vision would cost everyone thousands of dollars in equity. But the most dramatic moment came when she revealed what she thought was her ace in the hole. Ladies and gentlemen, I have evidence that Grant Miller is working with outside interests to undermine our community's future. He's been secretly negotiating to change the ownership structure of our lake in ways that could destroy everything we've worked to build. My throat went dry. The entire room seemed to freeze for a moment that stretched like eternity. I knew this was the moment I couldn't afford to be afraid, not for myself, but for my grandfather, for Agnes, for this entire lake that had given so much to so many families over the decades. The weight of generations pressed down on my shoulders, but instead of crushing me, it gave me strength. I hadn't planned to reveal my hand so early, but Paula's accusation left me no choice. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and pulled out the folder of documents I'd found in my grandfather's papers. Paula's right about one thing, I said, looking directly into the camera she'd set up for her social media broadcast. I have been negotiating about the lake's ownership, but not to undermine this community, to protect it. The room went dead silent as I explained what I'd discovered about the lake visionaries, their systematic takeover of other communities, and their plans to force out long-term residents to make way for luxury development. I showed copies of Agnes's research, the correspondence between my grandfather and Harrison, and the documentation of Paula's connections to the development company that had been pressuring Harrison to sell. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, neighbors who'd been neutral or even supportive of Paula began to understand what had really been happening in their community. Eli Burke stood up and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Paula, is it true that you're part of some group that's been planning to develop this lake? Paula's response was a masterclass in deflection and desperation. She tried to dismiss the evidence as conspiracy theories and old paperwork, but her voice was rising to that glass-shattering pitch again, and her red hat was tilting at an angle that suggested structural failure was imminent. That's when I dropped the bombshell that I'd been saving for the right moment. There's one more thing everyone needs to know, I said, pulling out the purchase agreement that Cal and I had finalized the day before. As of yesterday afternoon, I am the new owner of Lake Harmony and all associated water rights. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a fish jump. Paula's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as she tried to figure out if there was any way to salvage her plans. Her makeup was cracking under pressure, both figuratively and literally. But Paula wasn't done fighting. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her voice reaching frequencies that probably bothered dogs in neighboring counties. "You can't just buy a lake. There are regulations, there are procedures, there are community standards." That's when Agnes Rowley stood up with the kind of smile that retired lawyers reserve for their favorite moments of professional satisfaction. "Actually, dear, he can buy the lake. It's private property. It's been offered for sale under the terms of a valid contract, and Grant has every legal right to purchase it. What you don't have the right to do is harass property owners, install unauthorized surveillance equipment, or conspire with development companies to force people out of their homes." The meeting ended with Paula storming out of the community center, her red hat finally succumbing to the laws of physics and falling off her head as she clicked and clacked her way to the parking lot in those ridiculous platform sandals. Her husband Neil followed behind her, apologizing to everyone they passed like he'd been doing it his whole married life. But the most satisfying moment came when 3 of the people I hadn't recognized earlier introduced themselves as investigators from the county attorney's office, who'd been quietly documenting Paula's violations of surveillance and harassment laws. Apparently, Agnes Rowley had friends in the legal system who took a dim view of people who abused HOA authority for personal gain. As people filed out of the community center, shaking my hand and expressing their relief that the Lake Visionaries' plan had been stopped, I realized that this victory was just the beginning. I now owned a lake, which came with responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. But I also owned the power to make sure that Lake Harmony remained the kind of place where families could build memories that lasted for generations, where neighbors respected each other's space and traditions, and where no one could be harassed out of their home by someone with delusions of grandeur and a bad fashion sense. In the weeks following the community meeting, Paula Whitmore's carefully constructed world began to collapse, with the kind of spectacular implosion that would have been entertaining if it hadn't involved real people's lives. The county attorney's investigation revealed that Paula had violated multiple laws in her campaign against me, including illegal surveillance, harassment, and abuse of HOA authority. More damaging was the discovery that she'd been accepting payments from the development company to facilitate community cooperation with their planned resort project, payments that she'd failed to disclose to either the HOA or the IRS. The development company, faced with the reality that their target property was no longer available and their local contact was facing criminal charges, decided to cut their losses and withdraw from the Lake Harmony project entirely. They also sued Paula for breach of contract, claiming that her unprofessional conduct and criminal behavior had sabotaged a multi-million-dollar development opportunity. Within a month, Paula was facing legal battles on multiple fronts, with legal bills that quickly exceeded her family's ability to pay. The house that she'd bought 2 years earlier as part of her plan to transform the community went up for sale by early December, and the Whitmores moved away just before Christmas, leaving behind nothing but bad memories. Neil Whitmore, freed from his wife's schemes and constant drama, turned out to be a decent guy who'd been as much a victim of Paula's ambitions as anyone else. Before they moved away, he came by my cabin to apologize for his wife's behavior and to thank me for stopping something that he'd known was wrong but hadn't been strong enough to oppose. He filed for divorce 3 months later, citing Paula's pattern of deceptive and manipulative behavior. But the most satisfying aspect of Paula's downfall was watching the community come together to rebuild what she'd tried to destroy. Agnes Rowley was elected as the new HOA president in a landslide vote, running on a platform of common sense, mutual respect, and preserving the character that makes Lake Harmony special. Her first act was to rescind all of Paula's arbitrary rules and fines, including the $750 in violations she'd issued against me. Her second act was to establish a community fund for lake maintenance and improvement projects, paid for entirely through voluntary contributions rather than mandatory assessments. As the new owner of Lake Harmony, I had to make some important decisions about how to manage the property responsibly, while preserving the community character that had made this place special for generations. Working with Cal Weston and an environmental lawyer he recommended, I established the Lake Harmony Community Trust, a legal structure that guaranteed public access to the lake for all residents, while preventing any future development that would destroy the area's natural beauty. The trust included specific protections for traditional activities like fishing, boating, and swimming, along with environmental safeguards that would preserve water quality and wildlife habitat for future generations. The physical and social transformation of the community happened quickly once Paula's toxic influence was removed. Her unauthorized "Do Not Fish" sign was replaced with a beautiful wooden welcome sign that Eli Burke carved as a community service project. The sign read, "Lake Harmony Community Trust, preserving tradition, protecting nature, welcoming neighbors," and included a small plaque dedicating the lake to my grandfather's memory. Agnes organized a community cleanup day, and several families volunteered to help maintain the common areas that had been neglected during Paula's reign of terror. But most importantly, families started spending time together at the lake again, without fear of being cited for violations of arbitrary aesthetic standards. Kids learned to fish from the same docks where their parents and grandparents had learned. Neighbors borrowed tools from each other and shared vegetables from their gardens and actually enjoyed each other's company instead of worrying about being documented for future harassment. 6 months after Paula's departure, Lake Harmony had become everything she'd claimed to want, a place where property values were stable, where residents took pride in their community and where people wanted to live for the long term. The difference was that we'd achieved these goals by working together and respecting each other, rather than through fear, manipulation, and exclusion. The Lake Visionaries' model of community development had been exposed as nothing more than a sophisticated form of bullying, designed to benefit a few people at the expense of everyone else. On a warm Saturday morning in late spring, I was sitting in my grandfather's chair on the dock, teaching fishing basics to 3 neighborhood kids whose parents had asked if I'd be willing to share some of the knowledge my grandfather had passed down to me. As I watched these kids experience the same sense of wonder and patience that the lake had taught me 30 years earlier, I realized that Paula Whitmore had inadvertently given me something valuable. Her attempt to destroy our community had forced me to discover just how much this place meant to me and how far I was willing to go to protect it. That afternoon, I received an email that made me smile. It was from someone named David Chen in a lakefront community about 300 miles south of us. "Dear Mr. Miller," the email began, "I heard about what you did at Lake Harmony through a friend who knows Agnes Rowley. We're having a similar problem with our HOA and some people who seem to be following the same playbook that your Paula Whitmore was using. Would you be willing to share some advice about how to research and fight back against this kind of organized harassment?" I looked out at the lake, where families were enjoying a perfect spring day without fear of being harassed by anyone, and started typing my response. "David, I'd be happy to help. Let me tell you what we learned about fighting back when someone tries to steal your community. Some battles, I realized, are worth fighting not just once, but as many times as necessary to protect the things that matter most."